Welcome back to the series on exploring astrology as a mystical path. And in today's talk, we're going to be looking at Mars and how to relate to Mars in a mystical fashion. Now, it's important to note that your definition of mysticism and my definition of mysticism might be a little bit different. In my experience, through the practices of yoga and meditation, I've considered mysticism to be anything which allows you to experience a holistic, unified consciousness or a holistic, unified awareness. And because of that, as an astrologer, I consider the planets not to be separate entities out in space doing their thing, again, separate from who we are as individuals. I consider them to be aspects of our own consciousness, so aspects of ourselves, just like our limbs are aspects of ourselves, or our eyes are aspects of ourselves. Our body is an aspect of ourselves. It's not separate. And to that end, when I consider Mars astrologically, mystically, we simply have to look at what are the qualities of Mars, and then hopefully, if we can, consider how do we relate to and how do we express those qualities, either for good or for ill. And once we're able to take a good self-honest look at what our relationship is with that aspect of ourselves that we call Mars, then we are more likely to be able to work with Mars so that it functions in its highest, clearest capacity as it relates to our birth chart, as it relates to our life experience. Again, at this point in time, I'm more interested in your life experience rather than your birth chart. I know many people will think that those are the same thing, but they're actually not. The birth chart is simply the snapshot of the state of consciousness of your karma at the moment you were born. And then how you've related to that, how you've experienced that from the moment you're born until now, well, you've had plenty of opportunities to work with that, to adapt to that, and to even adjust it if necessary. And what we're going to be talking about today is how to express the qualities of Mars such that no matter what your birth chart shows, you are holistically expressing the highest capacity of Mars. And if you can do that, wherever Mars is placed within your chart, it will work better. Now, Mars itself, we need to consider the qualities of Mars. Mars is a dry planet, a masculine planet, a cruel planet. Mars represents courage, represents our relationships with peers and siblings, our ability to deal with acute obstacles. Mars is often said to be representation of our character, the strength of our character, who we are, what do we stand for, what are our personal ideals, where do we have courage, what do we stand up for, what do we fight for, what are our convictions, what kind of backbone do we have, how well do we use our logic, how well do we use the capacity for aggression. And when it comes to other qualities of Mars, such as what does Mars represent in our lives? It can represent anything of a red color. It can represent the marrow of our bones. It can represent anger, our capacity for anger, for fighting, for war, for battles, for dealing with enemies. Mars is our ability to see a problem and deal with a problem immediately, instinctually. Mars is considered a Kshatriya class or a warrior class. We're going to talk about all these things, so just hang in there. And as far as how Mars relates on a psychological level, Mars is said to be Temasek. Mars is also represented by quadrupeds, or things with 4 feet or 4 hooves on the ground. And the site of Mars is looking upwards. Now, these are all things that are covered in books like Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra, Satya Jatakam, and so on. But knowing what these qualities are, number one, it will help you understand Mars in a person's chart. But if you are willing to embody the capacities and powers of Mars in their highest function, their highest degree, well then, you are helping to integrate that part of Mars within your life. So mystically speaking, it's not just about meditating on Mars mantras or Mars yantras or seeing particular colors related to Mars or wearing colors related to Mars or getting the right Rudraksha beads or having the right puja or spiritual practice performed in your name. It's about how well do you integrate these qualities into your life. Now, let's just go through this one step at a time. And before we do, we have to remember that Mars is considered to be a cruel planet, a difficult planet. But that's because we live in a difficult world. When it comes to any of these cruel planets, we're going to find that they are a part of us as well, because we live in a world, in a dimension of time and space, where you're going to have to deal with difficulties. You're going to have to deal with problems. You're going to have to assert what you stand up for from time to time. It's just part of playing this game of life in this particular realm of existence. Just like with Saturn, every now and then you're going to have to endure suffering and difficulties. And how well can you bear that burden? Every now and then you're going to have to be patient. And as we'll see, and many of you have heard me say before, for example, when it comes to having a lot of benefic planets well placed within a person's chart or prominently placed within a person's chart, that's not always the best setup. You would think it would be, but if there are weaknesses somewhere else in that chart, well, the moment any of those weaknesses get activated, most of the time those benefics will crumble, because they're used to having things just provided for them through grace or through innate support. And that's why we have the cruel planets such as Mars and Saturn and Sun, because during those times when things aren't going so easy or aren't so graceful, well, that's where your grit comes into play. And now you just get through it, you survive it, you grow strong, and you're able to thrive in the midst of adversity until the wheel changes again. So we want to have a balance of all of the cruel and all of the benefic planets. And we want to have the grace when it's appropriate to have the grace. But we also want to have the capacity to stand up and fight when it's necessary. Now, Mars is a dry planet. The climate of Mars is said to be dry. And that does mean that when it affects certain areas of the body, yes, it will dry those areas of the body out. You know, if you have Mars impacting the area dealing with skin, it can cause a dry skin. It can cause issues with dryness on the scalp if you've got Mars influence in that area of the body. But on a more psychological level, the idea of being dry simply means that he's not really concerned with comfort. He doesn't care if things are moist and well lubricated and things go smoothly. He just cares about getting the job done. That's why Mars is often related to warriors or soldiers and even farmers, because the warrior, he's going to be stuck in a ditch, stuck in a trench. Who knows what he's going to have to go through, what he's going to have to survive, probably have to live off of grass. But because that soldier is driven to protect the country or protect their loved ones, they're willing to eat the grass and live in dirt and not have any comforts during the duration of that conflict. When it comes to being a farmer, I remember my spiritual teacher, Roy Eugene Davis, a student of Paramahansa Yogananda. He was raised in Ohio in the early 1930s, and he was a farmer. He was a farm boy. And it was always fun to watch him sort of talk to people who were asking questions about, well, how do I achieve that? Or how do I do this? Or I don't feel like doing this. And coming from that farmer mentality, he would always say, when you're a farmer and you've got cows and livestock and harvests and plants to deal with, he says, there's no question about, do you feel like doing it or do you want to do it? It's you have to get up and milk that cow every day at 4 a.m., whether it's -8 degrees outside or not. You have to tend to the crops. You have to go out and endure all kinds of weather, whether you want to or not, to make sure that your livelihood or your food source is available to you. And Mars is often related to soldiers and farmers for this reason, because the farmer, that's a hard life. That's a hard job. You're always battling with the elements. And you can romanticize that all you want, but I would recommend, if you haven't, try farming for a while. Even just try raising a decently large garden and see how you have to deal with pests and birds and every now and then a fungus on your plants. And sometimes weather will knock things down and you have to go out and you have to rebuild again. This is how Mars functions. So Mars is considered dry because he doesn't care about your comfort. He doesn't care about comfort, period. He just wants to know is there a job that needs done, and he'll go do it. So one of the things that we see with Mars is that if we're going to be manifesting the highest qualities of Mars, one of those things that are required of us is to simply learn to deal with the adversity, the conflict in our life when it needs to be dealt with. Not putting it off, not saying I don't feel like it, but recognizing that there are certain situations, certain circumstances that you just have to deal with a Martian approach. And that's why Mars exists in the solar system, in our chart, because it is a quality that is necessary for survival in this world. You spend some time looking at nature, observing nature. Sure, it's wonderful to, again, romanticize all the beautiful things in nature. But if you watch nature, there's conflict going on left and right. Battles between insects and birds, battles between birds and birds, other animals eating other animals, fighting for survival. It's happening all over the place. Even those beautiful bird songs that you love so much. Well, I saw a wonderful cartoon, or kind of like one of those Far Side cartoons. But birds are related to dinosaurs in a way. Whether you believe in that or not, it doesn't matter. They are. And when you hear those birds singing their beautiful songs, there's a few things that they're saying. Number one, they're saying, "Hey, mates, come over here and have sex with me." Or they're out there singing beautifully, and essentially what they're saying is, "Hey, everyone else, get the hell off my land. This is my property. This is my domain." So even in the beauty of the bird song, what we see is a focus on sex and territory and defending that territory. And sometimes in life we have to, react in that way. Mars is considered a masculine planet, so it's an active planet, meaning it goes out and does things. It's not passive. It doesn't wait for goodness to come to it. It goes and it decides what needs to be done, and it does it. From a spiritual perspective, ideally what one does is meditates until they are clear, and then they ask, what is the will of spirit? What is the will of God? What is the will of divine? What is the will of the infinite consciousness? And then they use their capacities to go out and make that happen. So the receptivity is, what is that will? What is the information? But then the effect of Mars is, now go do it. Go make it happen. And too many people in life, while yes, they can be very willful and that can be destructive, many people don't know how to use their will appropriately. So with Mars, it is learning that balance between will and surrender. But also considering the ideas of Mars as it relates to the idea of being a soldier. A true soldier doesn't go out looking for fights. A true soldier wants to defend the land, the territory, the kingdom, the king, the queen, the family. But they're not going out looking for fights, which means that they are calm and collected when there's no reason to be fighting. But they're confident because they know that should something arise where they have to act, they can do it. They know how to do it. So we have to remember, with this masculine energy of Mars, the healthy version of Mars is not what many astrologers and other people think of, where they think this person's macho, they're aggressive, they just take what they want all the time. Well, good Mars will take what it wants when it needs it, but a healthy Mars is not macho. A healthy Mars doesn't have anything to prove. A healthy Mars doesn't have to carry around a big gun and say, see, I'm tough. A healthy Mars knows that when a conflict arises, it's going to deal with it. So a healthy Mars individual would be someone who you would hardly even think they were an aggressive person. They're probably just hanging out, doing whatever they need to do. But they know that if an incident occurs, they've been trained, they've got the skills to take care of it. So they don't have to prove it to other people through outward signs of aggression or being macho or showing how tough they are, how big their guns are, how big their trucks are. That's not a healthy Mars. Mars is interested in things like weaponry and machinery, and that can just be an interest of it, but it's not flaunting it to show just how powerful it is. A healthy Mars doesn't need that, because if one has to flaunt their power, oftentimes there is some other kind of psychological complex going on there, that they're overcompensating. So always remember, when it comes to this masculine energy of Mars, it doesn't mean that one has to prove how tough they are all the time. They know how tough they are, and so they're calm, and they're collected, and they're actually peaceful, unless a situation arises which requires them to act right now in the moment. So Mars is a Krura planet, or a cruel planet, which means that he is related to the cruel things in life. Sometimes you might have to get a surgery. And if that's the case, you want a strong Mars, a healthy Mars in that surgeon, because Mars represents surgeons and surgery, because they're going to go in, they're going to be precise, know exactly what needs to be cut out, and they're going to do it well. They're not going to mangle you or mess things up in you. People who mangle actually is another name for Mars. And so when we think of someone getting mangled, well, that's Mars happening. But a healthy Mars is precise. A healthy Mars knows exactly what needs to be cut out and what to leave behind. So many of these tendencies, such as the cruel tendency of Mars, it's simply indicating that it shows that the direction of Mars is to deal with those cruel things in life. And that is one of the reasons why Mars is exalted in Capricorn, because when we look at how the sun, from our perspective, looks to rise to the North Pole and go down to the South Pole every year. Well, again, astrology is often seen to be seasonal, but it's not seasonal. It's based on where the sun is placed related to the planet Earth. In the Northern Hemisphere, it just made it was very easy to overlay the ideas of seasons, but it's not meant to be seasonal. In many texts, the northern part of the earth is said to be the realm of the devas, or the angelic forces, and the southern part of the earth is said to be related to the asuras, or the demonic forces, or the forces that deal with life and the cruel things in life. In the same way that our chakras within our body, the top part of our body, the chakras there are related to higher consciousness, clarity, truth, love, those sorts of things. And the lower chakras are related to things such as digestion, willpower, excreting that which isn't useful, our immune system, fighting battles, enduring, those sorts of things. So the earth itself, to the North Pole and South Pole, as the sun moves, creating the zodiac, and the chakras that are created there or reflected there, that is how the zodiac works, versus thinking of it seasonally. So you have to have an understanding of how the chakras function in the human body, and then you can, in a sense, relate that to the top part of the earth, the North Pole, being the realm of the devas, and the bottom part of the earth, the South Pole, being related to the lower chakra areas. If you do that, and you see how the sun moves through the various signs, you'll get a greater sense of what the zodiac is all about. But anyway, Capricorn is first chakra, and first chakra deals with survival. So why is Mars exalted in the first chakra? Because you want a good Mars for your survival, for your physical survival. If you get stuck out in the woods alone with a friend of yours, do you want a friend who is a poet and used to luxury and never really has done a hard day's work in his life? Or would you like to be stuck out in the woods with your friend who was a Navy SEAL, fought in 3 wars, was taken prisoner at some point in time and had to survive through that, and knows how to live out in the woods and how to survive? If you're in that situation, you probably want the Navy SEAL, because that is a strong Mars which will help one survive through that kind of ordeal. And that is what these cruel planets do. So how do you deal with adversity? If you crumble, if you can't make instinctual decisions that lead to higher fulfillment, or if you don't think you have the strength of character to endure difficulties, well, that's a clear sign that Mars is having some problems within your chart and within your life. And so you start figuring out ways to get over that. You start trying to be a little more decisive. Try to use your logic more. You might have to occasionally back up and say, well, I need to be aggressive in this situation, so I'm going to try my hardest. And of course, you may fail terribly, but that's exactly how Mars gets tough. When you think of these medieval warriors fighting with their bare hands or with swords or really brutal weapons, well, they got hurt a lot as they were learning to do that. So when you're developing your Mars, you can count on getting hurt from time to time. But Mars is okay with that because he realizes that's part of the training. And this can be applied to any area of your life. It can be applied to relationships, your work, the way you interact with your family, your physical body, any area of your life that requires some kind of training, hard work, decisiveness, and courage. The more you're able to put time and attention to developing that, even though you get hurt every now and then, but you get up and you grow from it, you are tapping into that cruel tendency of Mars, but also the successful capacity of Mars. So Mars, as our strength of character, what do we stand for? And do we know what is worth fighting for? Many of you probably know people who, it seems like they're always fighting about something. They get on social media and it's like just one thing after another just aggravates them. Well, the strong Mars would see most of that's not even worth it. Most of that's not going to change anyone's point of view. Whether you're on one side of a political spectrum or another, the people on the other side really don't care about what the other side has to say. So no matter how wonderful you think your logic is, for whatever you want to share politically or what your own ideals are, you have to really kind of step back and ask yourself, is this a fight worth fighting? Is it something that will actually lead to higher fulfillment? Or is it me just wanting to run my mouth and prove my own egocentric needs? Mars knows the difference. Mars knows the difference. This can be applied to relationships as well. Many of you probably know, and maybe you yourself, it's like you always feel there's something your partner needs to do differently, or you always feel that there's something they need to improve, or some way that they can change. And it always creates conflict, and you think you're just trying to better them, when really you're picking fights that don't need to be picked. Your sense of ideals, you're trying to impress that upon others rather than simply live them yourself and let that be your example. So while Mars can fight for its ideals when necessary, those ideals typically relate to living one's own authentic life. And if there are others that share that same kind of idealism, and should that way of life be threatened by other people or whatever, the Martian qualities can stand up and say, well, you've got your position, I've got mine. This is my character, this is my ideal, this is what I feel is right. I'm going to fight for it. Now, the other important thing about Mars is not a sore loser. Mars sees battles and sees fights as appropriate forms of growth, as a way to become stronger. And Mars also can concede a fight. So if you have two opponents coming together, or 2 points of view coming together, Mars isn't going to hold on to an ideal just for the simple sake of holding on to the ideal. If their ideals or their character is challenged, and there is ample evidence to show that that's what the way they've been living, the way they've been thinking, doesn't stand up, doesn't hold up to this new paradigm, they'll look at it logically and they'll concede, oh, I see that. Yeah, all right, well, you have helped me see a new way of experiencing, and I've grown from it. So the idea of idealism and courage and standing up for what one believes in, that is a healthy thing for Mars, but it's not blind. They will recognize when they have been beaten, and they will even adopt new ways of being if it seems like a better way of being. So Mars doesn't fight for the sake of fighting. Mars fights for the sake of protecting what it knows to be good. However, if it finds other ways that are are better, it will embrace those things, and then it will fight for those things. The sun is seen to be the nobility and the king, and Mars is said to be the general. Mars is also oftentimes related to rebellions and rebelliousness. Now, that's not just for the sake of being rebellious. It's not like being a teenager who just wants to be rebellious so that they can assert their individuality. The rebelliousness of Mars occurs because there is something wrong with their leader or their king. If they respect their king and respect their leader, respect the nobility that issues the orders to the general, they won't question it because they will trust in that higher power, and they'll do what needs to be done. Whatever it takes, they'll do what needs to be done. But if the nobility or the higher power or the director begins to show weakness or become illogical or erratic or dishonorable, they'll fight that because they want to serve the strongest capacity possible. And Mars is often related to the concept of truth. Mars fights for truth. The sage Ramana Maharshi was said to be an incarnation of Mars because the path of Ramana Maharshi of self-inquiry cut right to the core of the spiritual problem. Didn't mess around with all kinds of fantasy or funny ways of thinking about things just to get the mind to calm down, and went right to the core of it. When your Mars is strong, that's how you function too. You don't want to mess around. You just want to get the job done and move on. And you will follow the highest principle that you know, but you will also be willing to learn and grow as you go. Meaning you might start out having an ideal that this is the way it should be. But as you mature, you start to gain wisdom and you recognize, well, it's a little more complicated than that. And your capacity to honor wisdom grows and changes. So you're not holding on to a small-minded teenage idealism your entire life. You're learning and you're growing into the capacity for Mars to show healthy convictions, healthy logic. Now, Mars is said to be a kshatriya or a warrior caste. And for you as an individual, from this way of looking at your life as a mystical path, do you defend, do you support a healthy culture? And that's always a tough one because we're raised in a particular kind of culture with a particular set of parents. And we tend to think that what they know oftentimes is best, or we accept the culture that we're raised in, or we go the opposite end of the spectrum and we fight it so hard that we don't see the benefit of certain aspects of that culture. But as a kshatriya, Mars is about defending what is wholesome, what is true, what is supportive, and what is supportive of everyone, not just the individual. And remember, Mars is a soldier. Soldiers don't fight for themselves, they fight for each other. They don't just fight for themselves, they fight for each other. And the idea of being a kshatriya or a warrior caste doesn't mean to go out and brutally massacre people. The warrior is about defending that which is good, that which is supportive, and that which is supportive of everyone's happiness and growth. Even a police officer or someone in law who puts away a criminal, well, yeah, the criminal might not appreciate that, but it's for, number one, for the good of the criminal, so it doesn't create more karma, hurting more people. But it's also for the good of everyone else, so they don't get hurt. So that's a cruel way of seeing it. Now, that can be abused, as we know, but in a higher fashion, if someone can't be controlled, if they can't live in harmony with the whole, sometimes restraint is necessary, and Mars is there to do that. When it comes to the benefit of all, well, educating others, protecting others. The masculine energy is not about dominating. I remember I was in a band one time with a woman who was a self-proclaimed anarchist. And it was really interesting because I've got Mars fairly prominently placed in my chart. It's an okay Mars, but it's just prominent, so it's more there. It's taken me a lot of time to get a handle on it. But I remember we were having band practice, and when it comes to doing something, whether it's learning astrology or playing music, I tend to be pretty methodical about it because I noticed that if you develop good habits and routines, you tend to be better at something. And we were getting ready to practice for a show, and I kept trying to, number one, set up a time for us to get together to practice. And then I tried to create a set list for us to practice. So we'd go over each song and get really good at it. And every time I tried to impose, as she would say, a new way of doing it, she would just go off about how I was being patriarchal and controlling and overly masculine. I said, no, I mean, you can think that all you want, but I've just noticed that when I don't practice and I'm not on a schedule and I see other musicians who are flaky, they tend to not play very well, and they tend to not be able to do their craft very well. So this isn't about control. This is about just the training, the routine to make sure that we can do what we need to do well. And that's a very Martian way of looking at it. But the reason I bring this up is because my motivation was not to dominate her. It was so that we put out a good product to those people who came to listen. The real masculine energy takes care of those that it's responsible for, so that they can thrive, so that they can be free, so that they can express their innate qualities. So when a warrior energy or a masculine energy is needed, it's not about dominating others, about getting what the individual wants. It's about how can this serve the whole so that everyone is protected and safe. And it might be, in order to keep everyone protected and safe, there has to be a cruel action undertaken. Someone has to be restrained or expelled or disciplined, which are Martian qualities. But the underlying motivation is not out of cruelty. So you have to ask yourself, when it comes to relating to your spouse, to your coworkers, to your children, to your friends, when you're trying to control them and they're not listening, you know best, of course, but they're not listening. Is it because you want to feel safe knowing that they're going to do exactly what they should, meaning you want to feel safe that they're not going to be a wild card? Or are you trying to help them such that they are safe enough to explore their highest capacities in life? So what is your motivation? If it is for the good of all, wonderful. But if it's to keep your own little ego in a safety net, feeling safe, that's not a healthy way of looking at being a warrior or expressing your masculine energy. Now, we said that Mars is Temasek. And Temasek is referencing one of the gunas, or one of the primary cosmic forces of nature. Temasek energy, yes, it is dark, it is dull, it has to do with heaviness. That's a real simplistic way of looking at it. A Temasek energy, a Temasek quality is more about taking care of a problem so that survival continues. So it could be a cruel action. The way it was described to me, it's like, for example, if you're in a house and the house is burning down, well, a Temasek motivation is, I got to get out of here before I catch on fire and get burnt up. So you get out of that house because you're going to die if you don't. So Temasek qualities are about doing something because there's a problem that needs to be overcome. Rajasic energies are about transforming, making something better. So you can't make something better if you're still focusing on survival. And once you make something better, then we have the Sattvic qualities, which are that of peace and clarity and light, where you do or you act simply out of the sheer joy of the inspiration. Not because you want to make something better or not because there's a problem, but just because, essentially. So the quality of Mars being Temasek simply means that are you able to act when there's a problem and correct that problem to the best of your ability so that you get out of that problem? Because that Temasek energy, the reason Mars is there is he's an engineer as well, to engineer things such that you don't have as many problems, so that you can focus on making yourself a better person, so that then you can simply recognize your oneness with the wholeness of life, which is pure inspiration. And if you don't feel you should deal with your problems, or the problem shouldn't be there, well, you're not really tapping into the healthy Temasek quality of Mars. So there are kind of different levels of this. And number one is, what are the problems that you're dealing with that's preventing you from growing? That's always going to be what Mars deals with. And then what's going to make you better? That's the Rajasic energy. It's often related to Mercury and Venus. And then the Sattvic energy is, I've achieved, I've done, I've learned, I've grown, I'm good. I'm just going to enjoy. I'm just going to be present. So always remember with Mars, the Temasek energy is necessary. And it really requires a healthy approach to it, which many people might need some counseling in order to discover. And finally, the last aspect of Mars we want to consider is its sight. The sight of Mars is looking upward, and all the planets have a particular kind of sight. Now, Mars does deal with problems. It's a cruel planet. Saturn deals with problems. It's a cruel planet. Saturn's gaze is looking down, but Mars's gaze is looking up. Saturn's gaze is looking down because it needs to see what's coming its way so that it knows how to endure, how to brace, how to prepare itself. Because remember, Saturn deals with those areas, as we'll see, that cannot be avoided, the unavoidable things. Death, disease, old age, just being alive, whatever issues come with being alive. But Mars is a planet that's looking up, which means it's dealing with problems, not just simply to brace itself and to endure, but to see what is something better. How can I, once I surmount this obstacle, how will I be better? Once you learn to surmount obstacle after obstacle after obstacle, if you do it well with skill, with poise, and with grace, you learn that you can handle just about anything. And that way you can look up and you can see, all right, even though there's an obstacle here, I can see the potential behind it. That's why Mars is often ruled or rules over or represents things like engineers or inventors. The engineer, I don't know if you know anyone in your family who's an engineer. I mean a real engineer, not the kind of person who, their parents, the running joke is with astrologers, particularly with people of Indian descent, when they contact an astrologer for their children, all they really want to know is my son or daughter going to be an engineer, a doctor, a lawyer, or there's one other, but you get the idea. Are they going to be an engineer, a doctor, a lawyer, these real high profile kind of jobs. So if you've become an engineer just because you think it's high profile and high paying, you don't know what I'm talking about. But the real engineers, they see problems everywhere, and what they're seeing is, how can I make that better? They're looking up. How can I make that better? My father was an engineer, and I used to think that he was just critical, and Mars is considered to be critical. And it drove me kind of nuts because he would always see problems everywhere. But then as I got older and as I was in charge of my own household, and I never really paid attention to what he had to share when I was a teenager, so I didn't learn how to fix things like he did or build houses like he did. I completely appreciated that quality because he would come over and he would see certain areas of the house and he'd say, "Yep, that's not good. You're going to have to fix that soon. And here's how to do it." And he'd point it all out. And he was an engineer, and so he thrived on fixing those things. So he would come over, bring all the tools, and just go to town because it brought him a sense of joy to do that, to fix things, to make things better for their loved ones. So the idea of looking up for Mars does kind of relate to that engineering quality of, yes, there's a problem, but how can we make it better? Mars is not one of the easier planets to work with because it requires a good deal of strength. And many people in the world are lazy. And they don't want to change, and they don't want to grow, and they don't want to deal with their obstacles. They want things to just kind of happen. If that's the case, then you're probably not going to get a whole lot of benefit from really listening to this. But you have to ask yourself, how can I grow into these positive qualities of Mars if you want Mars to work better in your life and in your birth chart? And if you can step by step, logically figure out ways to do that, then you're going to find that no matter what comes your way, Mars is going to work well in your chart. And you're going to be able to deal with and overcome the obstacles that are placed before you. So get out of your mind when you think of mysticism, putting on a special robe and locking yourself in a closet and crossing your eyes and doing some kind of fantastic inner work. The real mysticism occurs when you activate your life, when you activate these qualities in your life. Then you will find that you you're a better integrated individual, and things tend to be experienced as a whole, as a supportive whole. And this is the goal of this discussion. So keep that in mind. Stay tuned for future videos on the planets in this way. And if you want more insights into the planets, there is a class I did a long time ago. It's a downloadable class at AstrologicalAstrology.com called The Myth and Magic of the Planets. It's one of my favorite classes, and it can give you a lot of deeper insights into the planets, how they function. I think each planet we spend about 2 hours. There's particular mantras and meditations related to the planet, as well as practical information about how to harmonize these within your life. Okay, so be well until next time.